Hi, everyone. Such an amazing conference so far, and thank you to the honorees and to all of you in the room. It's really wonderful to be able to follow in the footsteps and be part of this amazing community of scholars and advocates for justice. So, and in that spirit, I'm thrilled to be able to introduce our next speaker, Nisha Agarwal, Commissioner from the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs, for the Kellis Parker Keynote. This is a special pleasure for me because in addition to her amazing work, which I'll detail very quickly, Nisha's, have the good fortune to call her a friend and someone who has inspired me in my own thinking about these issues. So Nisha has been a leading voice on immigration reform at the local and national level. As commissioner, she led the development of the ID NYC municipal ID program, which those of you who are New Yorkers, I hope you have a municipal ID. If you don't, you should get one. She was instrumental in addition to creating Action NYC and Action Health NYC, two new programs that provide free and safe immigration legal help and affordable health care to every immigrant New Yorker in their community and in their language. Before going to the mayor's office, Nisha previously worked with Judge Robert Katzman of the Second Circuit to launch the Immigrant Justice Corps, a nonprofit that recruits recent law grads to partner with legal service providers, offer free legal representation to immigrants. In addition to that, Nisha's also been an incredibly creative and thoughtful organizer, working at the intersection of policy and social movements as a deputy director for the Center for Popular Democracy. She has numerous recognitions to which we hope to add this, our own modest one of the Kellis Parker Keynote. And she received her JD from Harvard Law School, was a Marshall Scholar at Oxford University, and perhaps most importantly, a fellow Brooklynite. So can we invite Nisha up to share her remarks?
Thank you so much to the organizers of this conference for having me here, and to Brooklyn Law School for hosting. And especially thank you to Sabeel Rahman for inviting me to speak today. I met Sabeel years ago at another conference that was also focused on law, inequality, exclusion, inclusion, power, and social movements. And Sabeel stood out then, as he does now, as one of the most insightful voices in the room, already full of thoughtful people. So I feel lucky to have you as a friend and a colleague. And congratulations also to the honorees. I'm familiar with some of your work, so I got a little excited when I got to see some of you in person. I was delighted to learn that I was asked to give a keynote named after Kellis Parker, who is a first in many ways, an important leader for civil rights and racial justice, and for people of color in the legal profession. But also because it turns out he's an accomplished trombonist who used jazz as a framework by which to understand the law. So I have actually been doing this thing lately where I've been using jazz as a rubric for the work we're doing at the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs. It seems to be going well, but I'm the boss, so who really knows? I had a slight worry that the staff might think it's a little weird or at least random. But now I feel very affirmed in the pedigree of this tradition, and I'm going to take that as a license to have jazz be the sort of loose framework for the talk that I will give here today for this conference that's focused in general on law, on movement building, and on organizing in the era of Trump. Specifically, I would like to use Miles Davis's album, A Kind of Blue, as the inspiration for sort of the structure of the talk today. And I'll just admit as a side note, it's only recently that I picked that album up again to listen to it. A Kind of Blue was my go-to record in law school, including listening to it on repeat during law school exams. So it's taken more than a decade for the association between A Kind of Blue and like Martha Minow's brutal 1L civil procedure exam to really disconnect, and I now, once again, have a very straightforward and emotionally unencumbered relationship to the album. First, though, let me share with you a little bit more about Moya. Mayor de Blasio led his campaign and has led his administration with a broad vision to challenge deep inequalities in the city. And for my office, this manifests itself through three goals. The first is this idea that immigrant inclusion should be a part of the DNA of city life and city government, especially in a city where 60% of New Yorkers are immigrants or the children of immigrants. And I think that has manifested itself in programs like the Municipal ID, ID NYC, where the purpose was really to provide government-issued ID for the undocumented, but we designed the program in such a way as to be appealing, we hope, to all New Yorkers. And we've seen that with more than 1 million people signing up for the card in just over 2 years. A second major goal that we had is around access to justice and the importance of access to counsel for low-income immigrants, not just from the perspective of course, stabilizing immigration status or getting on the path to citizenship, but also really to get on a path to economic justice and to economic stability. And then finally, a third goal has been advocacy. I come from the advocacy world and continue to do advocacy with other cities. We've come together, New York has, with about 150 other mayor's offices around the country to advocate on immigration issues at the national level. Cities cannot and should not be silent on the national stage on immigration. That was true before Trump, but now it's even more so since seeing the attacks as we have on so-called sanctuary cities. So that gives you a little bit of a sense of who we are and what we work on. And now I want to pull back again and bring Miles Davis back into the conversation. So as many of you already know, A Kind of Blue is considered to be one of the most influential records of all time. And one of the innovations of the album was that Miles Davis composed it as a series of modal sketches. That is, Davis gave his musicians a set of parameters. He really just gave them a set of scales within which they would then do their improvisation and bring their own style. And there was definitely not a full score or a conductor, as in classical music, and there wasn't even a set of chord progressions or harmonies, as I'm told is typical of jazz compositions. Davis literally provided sketches, which then, when the musicians came together, would require that they played together to create the sort of transcendent record that they did. And that is what Kellis Parker spoke about when he was using jazz to explore the role of the law in the lives of Black Americans. That law manifested itself not as black letter law, not as it was scored, if you will, but in terms of broader principles and parameters. As he said, "The law which sent my daddy to jail is not the law that we respected." So I would like to suggest that at this pivot point in our history, for those of us who are concerned about movement building, about power building and social change, that we start a discussion about the principles, the parameters, the sketches that will define our work together. There is so much noise in the air right now, frankly, a little bit of waywardness in social justice efforts, where one of the main defining features is that we should all be in unison against Trump. But what does that mean? Is that really all that we're about? I'd like to offer a few suggestions on things that we can focus on. First, we need to develop a coherent view of what progressive leadership means and a broader sense of what it looks like. We obviously have a very particular example of leadership in our current president, and there's not a lot to like there. But what is the alternative vision for social justice practitioners and scholars that we can offer? In my case, the question jumped to the forefront right after the election when my staff asked that I give an opening sort of visionary statement on our agency at the next staff retreat. What are our next steps, our future direction, especially against the backdrop of a national election that hit my team like a catastrophe? I was stressed about this request because I realized that fundamentally I'm sort of uncomfortable with the idea of a single leader deciding on the direction forward and asking others to follow along, as if a single person can have all the answers. It's easy to push back against that paradigm when you look at somebody like Donald Trump, but now this dynamic was playing out in the organization I've been asked to lead. It was almost like a collective look towards me to figure out how to make Moya great again. So this, felt like a big failure on my part in terms of creating the space for shared leadership. So this is the moment that prompted me to bring jazz into the framework of our office and the work that we do. Leadership is important, and it comes with the responsibility of providing direction, but I wanted a framework that captured concepts of participation, conversation, call and response, that eventually leads to the creation of a vision together. So for our staff retreat, I actually ended up starting my conversation with those 3 goals that I shared with you earlier about Moya's work. And then I quoted Thelonious Monk, who said, "Those pieces were written so as to have something to play and to get cats interested enough to come to rehearsal. That's it. We'll make music even in these dark times when the team brings what they have to the work, into the idea and vision shaping." And that's the long project that we're off to in Moya, to figure out how to shape our future, not looking or solely deferring to the leader or the person who's been defined as a leader, or even singing in unison or in consensus, but thinking, what are the processes by which we present suggestions, agree, disagree, and iteratively make something happen together. And I think that is clearly the question that we face as progressives writ large. The fact of the matter is there's still a tendency in social movement circles to deify particular leaders, as if the success of movements comes from this person or that person and not the people. Charles Payne writes about this in I've Got the Light of Freedom and the important, but often historically ignored role of women in the civil rights movement in favor of narratives that may lift up specifically mostly male leaders. It's a little bit of what we saw in the 2008 election, where there was this sort of false and unrealistic hope in President Obama and that he might be able to solve all of our problems, which was then followed by the sense of disappointment that came from not having an organizing apparatus in place that could, through push and pull, really allow us to together achieve more progressive aims than we were able to. And it's very much a part of the contemporary conversations I'm in about immigration and immigrant rights, and particularly who holds power in those circles in terms of race and gender, about who gets recognized, who gets to participate, and whose views are actually heard. Absent a theory and practice of, leadership and dialogue, we will inevitably begin to mimic the loudest, most visible example of leadership we have right now, and that is the brassy orange trumpet in the White House. So if my first suggestion was that we need to pay attention to leadership, who participates and how, my second suggestion is that we also have to look closely at silence and space and how we operationalize that in our movement as activists and thinkers. And I'd like to take as our example Kellis Parker's older brother, Maceo Parker, pretty much one of the baddest-ass saxophonists who's out there, who has played solo, played with James Brown in the 60s, Parliament Funkadelic in the 70s, and Prince decades after that. Maceo Parker's power as a musician is not in the notes that he plays, but from all the times he doesn't play. He is the master of silence, of holding the space, and at the right moment, in relationship to the other music that's being played, inserting just the right phrase and the right turn of notes. Playing with silence is what gives Maceo's music its funk. So what can we learn from him as a group of social justice lawyers and thinkers? Well, we've known for a long time now that the law, including the process of legal education, has a profoundly silencing impact on particular groups of people: women, students of color, low-income students. Lonnie Guinier wrote about this a few decades ago, focusing on silence of women in the classroom and then the outcome that that has on them, both as students and ultimately as professionals. Another scholar here at Brooklyn Law School, a friend of mine, Jocelyn Simonson, has written about these issues in criminal court, about who gets to participate in criminal courts, almost always white lawyers and judges, and who doesn't, almost always people of color who are the defendants and their family members and friends in the audience. These are obviously examples in which people are being silenced and it reflects oppressiveness. But Maceo Parker suggests that silence can also be powerful. So how does that manifest in our work? I've seen it happen. I've heard from colleagues around the country when we were talking about all of the actions around the Muslim ban in airports. And one of the things that most people found to be very disappointing was among the activists who was grabbing the microphone at the right moment. There were complaints that the anarchists were taking the microphone from the immigrant rights activists or this group from that group, and the sort of silencing that was happening within our own circles. And I would suggest for all of us as legal educators, as commissioners of immigrant affairs, as social movement leaders, we are all in positions of power. Perhaps many came from paths where we didn't have the same advantages as others or did not have access to traditional modes of power. But now we are there, and we have to be self-reflective about when we use silence, about how and when we choose to step back, and when we do so thoughtfully to not exert our power in order to make a broader point about our politics. I, for example, watch really closely about the dynamics in city council hearings. How are they being conducted? Who gets spoken to, spoken about? When is there booing and hissing and cheering and cutting off of people and interruptions? There's a lot that happens in the spaces that we occupy that speak to power and speak to the power of silence in certain places. How do we as progressives negotiate these spaces? How do we read the room, adjust the volume of our contribution so that we are not disintegrating within our own disagreements? We should have disagreements, but at a time, how do we sort of pull back at a time when some of these internal fights feel more winnable than the bigger external one, which is what we should be focused on. And finally, I'd like to just comment a little bit on a focus of this conference, which is how theory or academic and practice come together, and how vitally important that discussion between theory and practice, academics and activists, really is. One thing I will say is that this structural gap is very real. Again, working with your colleague, my friend Jocelyn, when we were leaving school, we realized as law students leave law school, they often don't have access to some of the kind of theoretical frameworks, some of the big ideas that they are exposed to when they are in law school. And public interest workplaces are not always open to that stepping back. You have to serve the client, you have to lead the campaign. There isn't really that space to think critically and step back. And the reverse is true as well. I think for academics, it can be challenging to really get into the weeds on how things are actually happening, getting into the minutia and the details, which is messy and complicated and often a headache. So the implication of all of that is that there might not be enough space for us for critique, for openness to self-critique. Are we following our politics? Are we being led astray? Are we doing good? I think just if we're in public interest, we're not necessarily doing good. We need to have space to think about that. I think there are ways to fix this. What we did coming out of law school was create something we called the Theory Workshop. It was basically a book club, but we would read, we came together with public interest law students, and a similar project is actually underway here at Brooklyn Law School, where we would read sort of theoretical texts and then talk about how those related to our work. It was a sort of organized space for critical reflection. Let's do more of that. Let's have more conversations like this, where as scholars, you invite practitioners in, and we, as practitioners, invite you into our conversations so we can sort of pull back from those conversations. You know, I think we need to do this more and do it more quickly and foster the sort of creativity that we see in fields like music and jazz and social movements. You know, in the 50s and 60s, you saw a growth in kind of social movement activity that was extremely fast in comparison to sort of social change as it typically happens. The same thing was happening in art and in music. We need to create that kind of energy now through whatever tools we have, because the time is extremely urgent. The context we're operating in is a dark time, and we need to push back against that with whatever we have. So in sum, I would like to just suggest that we keep talking about these three sketches, these sort of broad concepts. One is about the sounds we make, our leadership models and participation structures. Two is about the silence that we choose to keep. When do we step back in a thoughtful way to give or build power for others? And three, that we also turn inward to be self-critical as we all continue in the struggle in these times. And my final words will also be from the jazz great Thelonious Monk. A note can be as small as the pin or as big as the world. It depends on your imagination. Thank you.